Hi everyone.
Hey, Shashi.
Hi Maru. Should we wait for some more minutes?
I think Paul said he had some personal stuff to take care of. Are there more attendees on your side?
Actually, Irfan informed me that he is going to be late because of Ramadan prayer. So I'm not sure of Quinton actually.
Okay. We can probably get started.
Yeah. So is there anything on agenda? I didn't see much except one item from Bob, which was postponed. And the other one, let me share my desktop. Okay, and the other item I have for discussion is about this repo, this Federation DNS repo. This basically right now, shall we go on with this discussion or do we have any other items on the agenda?
Sure. I
Okay.
think, yeah, this is a good starting point.
Okay. So actually, this repo, Federation DNS repo, contains that V1 DNS providers and then controller. So we kind of developed a demo, which was basically the cross-cluster service discovery demo. And now it works. It is refactored based on V2 APIs now. So this will host that Federation DNS controller and the DNS provider. So we kind of decided, right? We didn't want to put that code in Federation V2, and it kind of contains the provider, the cloud provider stuff. So and then also we also wanted to maintain whatever was there earlier in V1, the DNS provider stuff, and going on, we'll try to move it to delegate this programming DNS to the external DNS. So that would be happening in stages, I believe. So I have kind of pushed one PR to external DNS to in this direction. I think we could start off making this repo into the officially maintained repo of Federation SIG. So I'm little unsure about all the process right now. Should we start off with a new repo and start getting the commits as PR, or how to go about it? I'm little unsure. So probably I'm expecting some suggestions from Maru or Paul.
I think, yeah, Paul's more the expert on what's required on getting a repo into the Kubernetes SIGs org. I'm kind of, when we initially talked about this, I wasn't sure whether a new repo is going to be required or whether the work could be done in the existing Federation repo since the code already lives there. Is it like radically, like your goal is to fork it essentially and have no link to the existing code in V1?
Your suggestion is to make use of the existing Federation repo?
I'm not suggesting, that was kind of like, I was assuming that, I don't know, for some reason I was assuming that might be the case. If you needed to maintain that code base, maybe it could be reused for both cases, but you're saying you just need to fork it and have it be separate.
Yeah, I think the existing Kubernetes KTS.io Federation repo contains a lot of unnecessary stuff, which is kind of almost stale now. So I think it would make sense to just move out this DNS provider to some new repo and maintain it from there.
Okay. And so what's going to be the, I guess I'm, when you talk about external DNS, And then Federation DNS, what's the responsibility of this new repo relative to what's going to be in V2 and what's going to be in the external DNS repo?
Okay, so we kind of have a new object called DNS, multi-cluster DNS object, which where I have raised one PR, and also that object is containing all the information required to program the DNS, and this Federation DNS is basically a controller which monitors that object and programs that DNS. Right now in V1 kind of a variant, it would use the DNS provider library from Federation V1, and in V2, it will basically delegate it to, so we have an option right now to go ahead with V1 or V2. Probably in the future, we are going to remove all our own maintained DNS providers, and we'll start using external DNS. So it might happen in stages, because I don't see happening overnight, because there could be some issues. So we didn't want to lose all the code which we have in V1. So that's why it is still maintained. The Federation DNS right now, it will be a container image kind of a thing. And also there is a chart now, so which will run this controller basically, which will be monitoring this multi-cluster DNS objects and programming the DNS. That's the job of that controller.
So this is kind of an intermediate step, and maybe in the future we could just use external DNS directly if it could be made to consume that new object. But until that happens, this is kind of this is what's going to program things.
Yeah, and also right now this will also act as an intermediate in the future too. Like we have a multi-cluster DNS LB object, and we need to give that information to external DNS in the format of endpoints. So somebody has to be converting that information to the whatever is required in external DNS. So either we could maintain that in Federation V2 itself, or in this repo.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think what you're describing sounds fine. My hope would be that eventually external DNS could actually understand an intermediate representation and directly, and Federation V2 would just run representation. Yeah. But as you say, that who knows how long that'll take, and I think what you're describing sounds fine as a way of moving forward. So yeah, I would reach out to Paul. He's kind of the expert on jumping through hoops.
Sure.
The fact that this code is not clean room means that I don't know. We had trouble with Federation V2 around that.
Yeah, I think whatever works. I think we have very few commits there right now. So we can start off with a fresh one if it warrants.
Yeah. I mean, because you're going to be consuming a lot of code from Federation V1, I don't really know what the policy is. Like when you went through the process for getting V2 in place, the fact that, Anyway, so yeah, reach out to Paul.
Okay.
And
we'll
good.
do that. Okay.
Don't have a lot of stuff on the agenda. So, I was going to give sort of a brief update on sort of where we're at with push propagation, because I've been making pretty good progress. Ivan's been making pretty good progress. If you've seen some of the PRs, probably we'll have CRD support merge this week, and that is entail like a pretty big shift away from type adapters and defining propagation in code, and moving to defining propagation as configuration via API resources. And this is kind of like on the path to actually moving everything to CRD. I have to do some research. The validation is kind of the sticking point, but my hope would be is that we can clear the hurdle of getting everything into CRD and release an alpha that does not require a separate API server or etcd. which should just be a dramatically simpler thing to deploy and maintain. So
yeah, that would be cool.
So if you're curious
yeah, and
about,
you don't anticipate, yeah,
keep going. Sorry.
yeah, Maru. Yeah, so the CRD, while moving to CRD, there were some hurdles, right? So regarding the support of multiple versions and a few other things I could, yeah. So I think, is this the right time to move to CRD altogether, our development efforts?
I think if, to my mind, we have, probably minimum of 6 months before we get to beta. And I think I'd prefer to focus on doing things as simply as possible. And if we find that it isn't appropriate, we can go back on that. But I mean, the cost will be, we have to generate a bunch of API types, but the actual code won't change. The way that the code is being restructured to support CRDs means that it's using the dynamic clients. It's not hard coding. Like, none of the propagation is actually using hard coded clients. It's all unstructured resources in the dynamic client. So the cost of switching in the future is going to be low. Does that make sense? So to my mind, it's like, I want to default on the lowest cost option, and with the understanding that if we do need to switch to a higher cost option, like it's mainly an operational cost, what we're talking about, it won't be prohibitive to switch. But I think kind of assuming we're going to do the simplest thing, kind of, to me, it's a motivator to figure out how to make it work. We have, I guess, 2 Cube releases between now and then. And if we need functionality to become available, or at least to start making progress, I think that gives us enough lead time to have an understanding of whether the feature will or will not be available.
Yeah,
I'm not too worried about versions myself, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I think that would be an eventual step about the multiple versions. But I think, moving to CRD is definitely, we need to go ahead, right? I think, so how much of a work is there? Like, how we can make the transition? Like, you have some PRs already, right?
The PR is up, that hopefully will be merging, is basically rewriting the propagation to work with configuration versus code and support CRDs. The next step is, like, the one stumbling point for CRD support is validation. When we use hard-coded types instead of CRDs, we get a certain amount of validation for free, because the API machinery will accept the type and go, oh, do you fit, secret v1? Do the fields match up to the values or as I expect? So that's the only real stumbling point, is creating a way of performing a similar level of validation for CRDs. I'm pretty, my expectation would be that there could be a generic webhook that would look at the expected target type and would be able to pull its open API spec and make sure that the embedded template conforms to that. I'm not entirely sure how much that's going to give us, because OpenAPI is notoriously, just not very complete. There's a lot more validation that happens behind the scenes, but we're not actually doing that today anyway. If I create a federated secret, it's validating that the fields are probably, I'm not even sure if it does membership. Like, if I have a field, like I'm thinking in a pod, you have constants, like image pull always, that kind of thing, or always just as a constant. I don't actually know if OpenAPI validates that correctly. I guess we're going to find out. But that's really the only stumbling block. Like, the propagation stuff is working with CRD. I have to clean it up and polish it, but essentially I can create a CRD, I can create a CRD template, a CRD placement, and I can run the CRUD tester against it.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, if I can do that dynamically in code, I mean, that makes it dramatically simpler for anybody who wants to do it. Anyway, so I think my goal here is reducing the complexity and the user experience, like the operational cost of this. to a minimum, because that seemed to always be a barrier around federation. Like, it was really easy to have things go wrong or to have people not understand. But if it's all CRD and everybody understands CRD because it's a well understood thing outside the context of federation, my hope is that that will lower the barrier to entry.
Sure. Yeah. And as a logical step, right? Okay, Maru, are you done?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. I was thinking, like, as a logical step to what we have in V1, right? Do you guys have given some thought on federated ingress? How we can move forward with that generic federated ingress?
I think probably Ivan's the best person to talk about that.
Yeah. So we had put some thoughts into federated ingress, but at the time we were looking to get kubemci support for basically doing what it does, but using an API and a controller. Google has been working on that initiative, and they've been contributing things to like SIG networking, but that's kind of been on hold. And we probably need to get an update on what the status of that is. But the idea is that we would leverage the kubemci work to support ingresses in federation.
Yeah, I think. Ivan, can you put out some link about that, like work? Is there somewhere documented about that?
No, it was just a bunch of gists that were put together just as some brainstorming sessions. Nothing more concrete. But we were at some point going to be receiving some docs from Google regarding possibly what that API might look like. But we need to probably touch base with them again and see what the status of that is. But I believe a lot of the work has been happening in SIG networking, and we just haven't been aware of it.
Did they present something at KubeCon?
Yeah, there was a kubemci talk at KubeCon, if anyone attended that.
I mean, maybe it's a topic to be raised in next week's multi-cluster meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, just to see if we can get an update, at least on what's going on there.
Sure. We'll put that in the agenda. Okay, and there was one more point. I think it was about the high-level placement primitives. I mean to say, right now what we have is based on cluster names, right? So I think in V1, at least we had something like a label-based cluster selector, right? So either or shall we build such a thing on V2 right now, V2 APIs?
I think the name-based is the lowest level thing and not necessarily the thing that a user would see. I mean, if you want to go ahead and build something that's selector-based that can resolve to names, I think that's entirely reasonable. I would just suggest that it's not going to replace the name-based one. It just needs to be a layer above. Yeah, so as long as that's understood, if you think that's an important priority, by all means.
Yeah, I'm just thinking aloud, like what all features we want to take it forward from V1.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that the near-term goal is getting into CRD and getting it to an alpha so people can actually use it. We weren't necessarily compiling code or like working with developers. I think selector-based, like that would be something that some people would want. We have, scheduling is something people would want. Probably pull-based propagation might be something people want. Certainly policy stuff. but like, I think having sort of a base to work from, like my goal again around getting like a push propagation to be dead simple is that then hopefully people can write functionality on top of it. Like the hard part about Federation V1 is like you had to understand so much to do anything.
All right, right.
And if it's just a matter of like maybe we need example, like maybe the scheduling stuff that Irfan's working on can maybe serve as an example if we can like provide sort of a simple one where it's like, okay, I'm gonna read some resource, I'm going to, or actually maybe what you're talking about is actually the simplest example. Like if you were to create a new resource that was selector based.
Okay.
Yeah, to be honest,
think,
like it's kind of a hard problem to solve, like to me, because like the associativity is not simple. As soon as you have separate resources, it's like, how do you guarantee unique associativity, like a one-to-one mapping, or if you have not a one-to-one mapping, how do you resolve conflicts if you have multiple selectors applying? Like there's all kinds of vagaries that I think will be encountered that I don't know how to make it simple, but I definitely think that's something people want. So maybe that's something.
Yeah, I think, sure.
So I guess my suggestion would be is maybe it can be the subject of the design doc. Just think about like what's the simplest thing we could possibly do as a starting point, and not saying we don't want to solve the more complicated stuff, but probably getting something done is more important than getting the perfect thing done.
Yep, agree. Okay. And is there anything else we want to discuss?
In the context of clusters, also the federated cluster resource, I'm just thinking like sometime in the future, not something we need to solve now, but I think we need to figure out the story behind the integration with the cluster registry and what federated clusters do versus what the cluster registry clusters do, and like how status is reported in federated clusters. Right now, status doesn't exist for the cluster registry cluster, but that's sort of a to-do. Eventually, that might get fleshed out. But just thinking about long-term, what we want to do there.
I don't know, I'm not too concerned long-term. I think if cluster registry comes up with something compelling, because people have use cases that, provide for, like, you need status, you need to understand, what the health of the cluster is or whatever. But I think the chances of that converging on what Federation needs in the near term are pretty slim. But you did raise a good point about cluster registry, because we're going to have to move Federation V2 to CRD-based registry in the near term very soon.
So that feature is already landed, the CRD for cluster registry?
Yes, it's just about ready to get merged, probably today.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, I'm looking forward to being able to deploy Federation, where it just consists of apply these YAML to create the CRDs and to launch a controller. And then you got to join, so you still need kubefnord, but at least running Federation, getting it installed is actually going to be really simple.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from Bob about CERN's plans. I saw their KubeCon presentation, and I was really curious as to whether they knew about Federation V2. It seems like they were using Federation V1 to distribute batch jobs across their clusters. Did anyone else see that video?
Yeah, CERN presentation, right?
Say again? Oh yeah, CERN, yeah.
Maru?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we watched that, and I think it seems like a very good use case for federated jobs.
Mhm.
And probably we should be able to do that with V2 too, right?
Yeah.
I
Not,
think right now some of the features are missing, like the high level features for jobs. Right now, it can just do overrides, right? Um,
yeah, and
maybe,
overrides are kind of weak because jobs are immutable, or like
yeah,
yeah, as Dario found out. um,
yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Sorry, Maru, what's the problem with job?
I thought that you discovered that like you.
Yeah. I remember.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's like a timing issue. If you create the job and then set an override and the job's already been created, then it's not going to work.
Okay, that's.
Yeah,
okay.
like I think that's kind of still an unresolved thing. Like how, like we just have to document it, I guess. But I guess it implies having, like, you want to change a job, you kind of have to delete it and start over, at least for that cluster. Like remove it from the cluster and then add it back. Like.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the problem is that for a user, it's not easy to understand.
Yeah.
The way overriding is working. So when you think I'm overriding this, I think I would like just to modify this, what I have in the spec, which is not true.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
But I mean, maybe override. I'm not saying it's the perfect term. I think it's better than substitution, but.
Yeah, no, I was not trying to find a better term. I'm just saying that if I am a user and I want to create any kind of resources and I want to override, I imagine that the resource is going to create it directly with my new spec, right? And not later on, not after an update.
Right. Yeah.
That's the misunderstanding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't really know how to simplify it because we're sitting on top of the Kube API. And I mean, if you were to create a job and then try to edit it, that would fail. But I mean, you have to understand that in order to know how federation works. And you have to know about the order of creating these resources and how it relates to how propagation works. It's a lot of detail. Too much, I think. But I don't have a good sense of how to really simplify it without having them I mean, at the API level, like I think we could do some sort of like web app that made it clear. And maybe you would create like a job and create overrides, and then it would know. It would say, oh, if you apply this override, the only way it can work is if I remove the job from the cluster and re-add it. But the API has no way to give that detail.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Actually, no, it could. I mean, if we had validation that was smart enough and you tried to override something and it saw that the resource had been created in the cluster you were trying to set an override for, we could do it. I mean, I'm not sure it would be better, but it would be possible.
How can you update an immutable field?
You wouldn't update it. You would essentially have to, like, I guess my suggestion is if you went and set an override and when you went to submit it to the API would go, hey, that resource already exists in this cluster. I can't apply the override without, removing the job from the cluster and re-adding it, which may or may not be desirable, but at least it could give you the option. It could say, hey, you can't apply this override because the object's already created. What do you want to do? You could either manually delete it or you could, stop.
I have a time to see this as a solution. I think that this solution is worse than the real problem, because you cannot say, okay, I'm going to override, but to override this, I need to delete the previous one. And
well, I'm not saying that would be. You could say, like, you could fail the update and say, if you want this update to happen, you have to remove the job from the cluster and then I'll let it work. And then at that point you could decide like, oh, is this super important that I want to do that? Or, oh, I guess I'm just going to let the job run with whatever number of instances it had. Anyway, food for thought. I mean, the problem is we're limited by what Kube can do. We can't magically make it better than it already is or different. Yeah.
And Maru, also there was one more point regarding the propagation policy. We can introduce some policy to the propagation, the placement objects. Maybe like whether we want to do all at one shot or one after the other, something like that. So, so we can.
I think that would be kind of like a higher level thing. Like it would.
Yeah, but we can bake it into the propagation, I believe,
No.
right?
No. My suggestion would be is that propagation is simple and just dumb. And then if you wanted to have a higher order behavior that did things like I'm assuming you're talking about like canary, or what is the term? Where you would roll out to say one cluster, and if it worked, you'd roll out to other clusters. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Maybe at least we can build. This would be like a basic functionality using which we can build higher level features. So I don't think
you would
so.
do this at a higher level. Like the idea would be is you would have something that would set, say, a single cluster, and then watch the status. And if it was successful, then it would add other clusters. But it wouldn't actually change the propagation mechanism at all. It would be a higher order thing that just used the primitives to program the propagation. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm not saying that's my assumption is this would be simpler to implement because it doesn't involve any of the vagaries of propagation. It's something strictly additive.
Okay. I was thinking like, how could we, because this currently the logic belongs to the push reconciler right now. So
what logic do you mean though?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can discuss that maybe some other time. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, to my mind, like the separation of concerns is something I'm really trying to maintain. So I'm not saying the functionality shouldn't exist. I think that it's definitely valuable. It's been something that people have asked for. But I think mixing things together, especially like, yes, some people might want this, but is this the most important thing? And do we want to make the thing that maybe most things are going to rely on more complicated for the use cases of a few? Versus, can we do this as a strictly additive feature that doesn't necessarily have any impact complexity-wise on that fundamental feature?
Okay.
Shashi, I think I agree with Maru. I think that seems to be a higher level functionality which can be done using a different API. It'll be easier to express also as a different API, and maybe implementation might also be simpler.
Okay. Yeah, I need to give some more thought into that, but yeah, I may not be able to understand completely at the moment. Okay.
I mean, I do think that there's some cost to having separate resources like that. Like, it's not that this is a free approach to doing things. My hope would be is that the simplest stuff can remain simple, and like a higher order thing that did, like you could have a higher order placement resource that did both selector based placement and also applied or tried to apply rules about order of placement, or like how would you describe the feature you're talking about?
Okay.
like
But
placement procedure, like I don't know what you want to call it, but something like that. But hopefully there could be kind of like a uniform interface up top over time. Like initially it might be a good idea to implement it as separate resources because we're not necessarily sure how things are going to evolve. But as things solidify and we, develop good solutions, I don't see why you couldn't have higher order things collapsed. Because frankly, I mean, the lower level stuff, I'm seeing less and less reason to have template and overrides separate. We still need a generic way to apply overrides. But at some point it might make sense to have overrides and template in the same resource just to reduce the complexity for the user. The only real reason we need to have it separate was to sort of give us room to evolve and also potentially to have different, like to be able to have selective RBAC. But if we can use sub-resources, say for overrides, then there's no reason you couldn't have them existing in the same resource if we're happy with the form they're taking. Sorry, that's kind of abstract, but I guess my point is simply that there is a cost to having things as separate as I'm wanting them to be, and I'm hoping over time we can reduce that cost.
Yeah, but to implement something like a high order feature, right? Most of we might have to rewrite re-implement the push reconciler, right? So all we would be reusing is the APIs. So you implement your own behavior.
No,
right?
What do you mean by re-implement the push reconciler, Shashi? Like,
I mean, like say for this feature, for example, there is a replica set as well, and in cluster I want to place it one after the other instead of parallelly pushing to all the clusters, right? And if I had to implement such a policy, right? Right now, I may not be able to use this whatever the existing sync controller, right?
no, you would be. See. You would be developing a controller separate, which will uh, cater or which will handle only the basic three types. Means it'll update the basic three types or create or maybe placement would be only one cluster. Once your controller ensures that this cluster objects are healthy, then it'll update the placement to make it into two clusters. That way. So it will not directly be creating any resources into each of the clusters, but it will be updating the basic three resources. Not necessarily the template, but the other two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of.
We can talk about this offline.
Yeah.
Like I sort of understand this because this is what I'm doing in the scheduling resource. Like this is what I'm handling. I mean, this is how I'm handling it. And I think that's what is, I mean, that's the whole point of having the basic layer and the higher level or the higher order APIs and controllers for them above.
Sure. No problem.
I think that's like a good starting point. That's not to say that at some point, it might not be something you want to optimize.
Yeah,
and
correct.
We can, consider that in the future. But I think as a sort of development strategy, layering things gives us a lot of flexibility. If the path turns out not to be valuable, we can just throw it away versus having to excise it from the code. So,
or if it has some performance bottlenecks or overheads, then also we can rethink about doing this.
Yeah, and those can be sort of handled separately. I think the biggest thing for me is separation of concerns, both for development, for maintainability, for development speed, and also just limiting the amount of complexity we have to think about at any one point. I found it very difficult to work with V1 because whenever we had to make a change to something, it was so entangled that one change could have really unexpected consequences. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So what did I miss? Like I didn't see any updates in the notes. Like I joined at around 10:30. So
we're bad note takers.
okay, I mean, if there wasn't anything important which was discussed or maybe needed for the wider audience, we can skip it also.
I think the TLDR for me was that there's PRs up that are implementing support for CRDs.
Okay.
I expect to have that merged by the end of the week.
Okay.
And that kind of opens the door for the next step, which is actually moving all of the Federation resources to CRDs. So my goal is basically removing the need for an API server as a precondition for releasing an alpha. And that'll be also in concert with moving to the CRD version of the cluster registry. So when we release an alpha, it will consist of a lot of YAML and probably kubefnord or kubefed for joining clusters. But actually initializing things and maintaining it, it'll just be controller. It won't be API server.
Okay, makes sense. So about CRDs, I had a brief look at one of your PRs. I haven't actually gone through the code that you have submitted. So when you say those PRs are adding support for CRDs, that I understand is that they would be adding support to federate any given CRD resource. Am I right? Or
correct?
Okay.
So that's kind of the starting point in getting some degree of understanding of CRDs. And then the next step is just moving everything to CRD. And that'll also be, I mean, there's an investigation required around validation. But if that hurdle can be cleared, then moving to CRD will also imply moving off of the API Server Builder and onto Kube Builder.
But these two are probably orthogonal, right? Like rest of the APIs so far implemented, if they need to be moved as CRDs to an existing API server or aggregated or joined with an existing API server, I don't know how to put it. For example, use the K8s API server and just run the federation as a CRD resource. All of these APIs are CRD resources, and then federating CRD. These two are orthogonal, right?
They're kind of orthogonal, but I needed to sort of work with CRDs to understand some of.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And it also means that, like currently, all of the templates and placement and override resources for the types that are implemented already, they're first-class API types. And in order to sort of support CRDs that could be, created dynamically, all of the sync controller had to be moved to use the dynamic client. And so once the sync controller is using the dynamic client and it doesn't need an API, then everything can be a CRD. So you could do it without the dynamic client because, Kube Builder will generate you client stubs. But if you're using client stubs, that means that you're still needing adapters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the move to the dynamic client means everything's a CRD. You don't actually have any special, you don't actually code behavior to support a type anymore. And so the next step after this that I haven't really talked about thus far, it's been something we talked about internally at Red Hat, is that it will not be necessary to even define CRDs for templates and placement as a minimum to propagation. It should be possible to have a higher order resource that defines what your target is. And it'll be a controller that actually generates the CRD or the primitives as CRDs. And then the generation and configures it. So what I'm suggesting is that the path we're going down is that it should be possible to federate every single resource in an API, because you could have a controller that looked at the discovery endpoint, looked at every single type, made sure there was a federated or federation resource description or resource definition, kind of like the equivalent of CRD, and then some other controller would read that and generate the primitives, and then you can federate it. So it actually would remove entirely the need to code anything. Like obviously if you need special behavior, but I think we're likely to add support for webhooks if you need special behavior. Does it make sense?
Slightly the generation of the definitions for placement and overrides. You're talking about. You're not talking about a runtime behavior, right?
I am.
Like.
No, I am. That's kind of the
Oh,
point. Is
okay. That
like,
is a little confusing for me. I'll need to understand it better.
I mean, I think once you start working with CRDs and realize that CRDs are just API types, and I mean, if you want to interact with them in Go code with a client, yeah, you need to generate stuff, right? But if you just want to have these primitives in the API so that someone can use them, like yes, you probably want to generate a CRD and then have something that would generate you a client separately. But on the server side, enabling propagation for something like, I mean, you don't actually need a client, right, to use kubectl.
Correct.
Right? You can actually just have
it discovers, it figures it out,
And so potentially you could generate a CRD for a template and for a placement, and you could use YAML to create resources and manipulate them in the API. And then the propagation controller wouldn't need any special, it wouldn't have to be changed. Like it's going to know how to work with the CRD simply on the basis of API resources.
Okay, so it basically deciphers all this from the YAMLs which are defined, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would encourage you to take a look at the PRs are up right now. I mean, you've worked with the sync controller to get the scheduling stuff working. So there's some pretty substantial changes in the switch to the dynamic client. But in the end, it means that there's no such thing as an adapter. Like it basically treats the API types like it's almost like duck typing, but on the level of API resources. As long as it has a template field, it knows what to do with it. As long as the placement has a cluster names field, it knows what to do with it. And it doesn't need like a hard-coded type. Unstructured is what the dynamic client uses internally, and it's basically just a map of interfaces. It's just interfaces all the way down. So, but all that to say is that the goal here is just dramatically, like making everything dynamic so that we don't have to have code to support the behavior we used to have to write code for. Like all the adapters are gone at the end of this PR chain, and everything is just defined as configuration.
Okay.
That's not to say there's not special casing, like services and namespaces still need like special hard-coded behavior. But my hope would be is, we can minimize that and maybe even push the special behavior off to webhooks so that it's also dynamic.
Okay. So for higher level controllers, like what I am writing, I would still be using a client, and I would still have the basic API types, even if they are like they are defined only in config.
That is true if you want to hard code your behavior, but there's also the possibility in the future that maybe you could have, like in the case of scheduling, you're scheduling potentially replica sets and deployments, right? And they both have the same replica count field.
Correct.
So potentially you could write something using the dynamic client that didn't actually, like you still need to configure it, but internally it doesn't actually know whether it's dealing with a replica set or a deployment. Maybe it doesn't care. So I'm not saying you want to work on that immediately, but like once you understand the problem and you want to make it generic, this is kind of a path to making it, like then you could schedule anything that had a replicas field. So if somebody has some other thing that works that way. Like I'm not actually, I don't understand, for example, like HPA well enough to know if that's something that would be a pattern that could apply to that as well. But I guess I should say I've been pretty excited at the prospect of not having to write code for this stuff, because I mean, I remember having conversations last year where it seemed like we just had to write code. And so we've gotten to the point where it's like, oh, actually we don't have to write code. It's pretty exciting to me.
Yeah. Cool. That sounds very interesting.
So yeah, feel free to. I mean, I'm mainly just looking for like the PRs. I'm looking for feedback for sure. I don't think the code is particularly clean. Like at some point there is going to have to be, okay, we're actually going to develop for real and not just prototype endlessly. But all the PRs, like, I think it's a good opportunity for people to familiarize themselves with sort of the direction and some of the techniques I'm using, and almost as much as it is to provide feedback on the quality of the code, because it's terrible quality. I'll admit that up front. Yeah. So
Yeah,
we're hopefully going to
the word terrible that you meant, it's a different standard for different people. So you don't need to necessarily, I mean, others might not feel it to be that terrible. Okay.
Well, when I say terrible, I mean, for me, I'm more worried about just getting it done than in making it maintainable. So I would say maybe terrible is kind of vague. I don't think the code that I'm writing is particularly maintainable. And I definitely want, like, for the alpha, maybe I don't care. But once we start thinking about going beta, then I'm going to definitely want to clean things up and make it so that it's concise, it's documented, it's tested, so that if I get hit by a bus, it's not impossibly confusing for other people to come in and maintain it.
Yeah, I think that's the idea we are also working with. Like, I think we did talk about this earlier, that the mandate to us, like Shashi, I, and one or two other internal folks, is that if we are able to drive the V2 with some feature parity, with some level of feature parity as V1 until it becomes alpha, then it'll be okay for us. Right?
Yeah. So. And I would say that is kind of maybe one of the stronger motivations behind the separation of concerns thing I'm talking about, is I think the cost of prototyping where there's strong separation of concerns, I think that's acceptable. If we were recreating Federation V1 and everything was just tied together, it would be impossible to actually drive it to a position of quality. Yep. But I think if things are like isolated and you can take a little piece and improve the quality independent of everything else, then I think we have the potential to actually succeed.
Yep. Makes complete sense.
Cool. Anything else? We're kind of nearing the end of the session.
Yep, I don't have any specific stuff. Anybody else?
So.
Yeah, that's all, I think.
Okay, I think we can close the meeting. Yeah, one more thing. Just one last thing. See, the updates to the notes can be done by anybody actually, but I'm not sure who all does not have write access to this. Does it make sense to give write access to the mailing list, that SIG multi-cluster, the Google group, I mean?
I think so. I mean, if someone abuses it, we can always change that, but being default permissive makes sense to me.
Okay, I'll update that now. Cool.
Yeah, I added some suggestions.
Yeah, looking at that is what I just put this point, because I have in past given access to whoever would volunteer to update some notes. Maybe everybody should have access, right?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We're a small enough group that I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ivan. Anyways. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.